When Robespierre met the guillotine, the most brutal fall of the reign of terror in the blood-soaked chambers of revolutionary France, where the machinery of death had transformed justice into spectacle and political disagreement into grounds for execution, there arose one man whose name would become synonymous with terror itself: Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible architect of systematic murder, who orchestrated the deaths of thousands in the name of revolutionary virtue, only to discover that the same merciless logic he had applied to his enemies would ultimately consume him in a fall from power so dramatic and brutal that it would mark the end of the most violent period in French history and demonstrate how revolutionary violence inevitably devours its own creators. This is the investigation into how the man who perfected the art of political terror through mass execution became trapped in his own web of paranoia and suspicion, leading to a conspiracy among his former allies that would subject him to the same summary justice he had imposed on countless victims, culminating in his destruction through the very instrument of death he had wielded with such ruthless efficiency against anyone who dared oppose his vision of revolutionary purity. Today, we explore the contemporary accounts, official records, and eyewitness testimonies that chronicle the final weeks and days of Robespierre's reign, revealing how his increasing isolation, growing megalomania, and threats against virtually every other revolutionary leader created the conditions for his dramatic overthrow and execution in a sequence of events that would transform the champion of terror into its most ironic victim. Our investigation begins in the spring of 1794, when Robespierre's position as the dominant figure on the Committee of Public Safety had made him effectively the dictator of France, wielding unprecedented power over life and death while maintaining his public image as the incorruptible defender of revolutionary virtue, who alone possessed the moral authority to determine who lived and who died in the new republic. Contemporary documents reveal how Robespierre's control over the Revolutionary Tribunal had created a systematic killing machine that executed an average of 30 people per day during the height of the terror, with victims ranging from former aristocrats and priests to fellow revolutionaries who had fallen under suspicion of insufficient dedication to the cause of revolutionary purity. The political atmosphere in Paris during the spring of 1794 was one of constant fear and paranoia, with even the most prominent revolutionary leaders living in terror that they might be denounced, arrested, and executed based on Robespierre's increasingly unpredictable judgments about who constituted a threat to the revolutionary cause and who deserved to die for their alleged crimes against the people. Personal correspondence from the period shows how Robespierre's former friends and political allies had begun to recognize that his growing paranoia and megalomaniacal tendencies made him a mortal threat to anyone who might be perceived as a rival or obstacle to his absolute control over revolutionary policy and the machinery of state terror. The execution of prominent revolutionaries like Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins in April 1794 demonstrated to other political leaders that even the most dedicated servants of the revolution were not safe from Robespierre's suspicions, creating a climate of desperate fear among those who realized they might be next on his list of enemies to be eliminated. By July 1794, contemporary accounts describe how Robespierre had become increasingly isolated from his former colleagues, spending long periods alone in his lodgings while developing grandiose plans for new festivals of revolutionary virtue and composing speeches that revealed his growing belief that he alone understood the true meaning of revolutionary justice and moral purity. The political crisis that would lead to Robespierre's downfall began to develop when his speeches to the National Convention started including thinly veiled threats against unnamed enemies within the revolutionary government itself, creating panic among his colleagues who realized that anyone could be targeted as a traitor based on his increasingly arbitrary and paranoid judgments. Contemporary parliamentary records show how Robespierre's fellow committee members began meeting in secret to discuss their growing fear that he was planning a massive purge that would eliminate most of the existing revolutionary leadership and establish himself as the sole authority over French politics and society. The conspiracy against Robespierre gained momentum when his former allies realized that their choice was between destroying him or being destroyed themselves, as his recent speeches had made it clear that he viewed virtually everyone else in the revolutionary government as potential enemies who might need to be eliminated for the good of the revolution. On July 26, 1794, known as 8 Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, Robespierre delivered what would be his final major speech to the National Convention, a rambling address that contained threats against unnamed conspirators while demanding new powers to purge the government of enemies, inadvertently providing his opponents with the justification they needed to move against him. The dramatic events of 9 Thermidor, July 27, 1794 began when Robespierre attempted to address the convention but was shouted down by a carefully orchestrated group of conspirators who had decided that this would be their only opportunity to destroy him before he could destroy them through his control of the revolutionary apparatus. Contemporary eyewitness accounts describe the chaos that erupted in the convention hall when Robespierre found himself unable to speak over the coordinated interruptions of his former allies, who had transformed overnight from terrified subordinates into determined enemies willing to risk everything to bring down the man who had terrorized France for over a year. The formal accusation and arrest warrant against Robespierre were rushed through the convention in a matter of hours, with his former supporters either joining the attack against him or remaining silent as they watched the architect of terror become subject to the same summary procedures he had used to condemn thousands of victims to death. The immediate aftermath of Robespierre's arrest created confusion and chaos throughout Paris, as various factions attempted to either rescue or eliminate the fallen leader, while the city's population tried to understand what the overthrow of the man who had embodied revolutionary terror might mean for their own safety and survival. Contemporary accounts describe how Robespierre was initially taken to the Luxembourg prison, but refused admission by guards who feared that housing such a controversial prisoner would make them targets for violence, leading to a desperate search for secure detention, while armed groups roamed the streets seeking either to rescue or destroy the fallen dictator. The brief period when Robespierre's supporters managed to free him and bring him to the Hotel de Ville provided a few hours of false hope that he might be able to organize effective resistance. But contemporary witnesses describe him as psychologically broken and unable to function as his political world collapsed around him. During his final hours of freedom at the Hotel de Ville, eyewitness accounts describe Robespierre alternating between desperate attempts to rally support and periods of complete despair as he gradually realized that his political career and very likely his life were finished, with even his most devoted followers beginning to abandon him as the reality of his situation became clear. The final assault on the Hotel de Ville by National Guard troops loyal to the new government resulted in the gunshot wound that shattered Robespierre's jaw under circumstances that remain historically controversial, with some accounts suggesting suicide attempt while others claim he was shot by attacking soldiers who had come to arrest him. Medical descriptions from the period reveal the devastating nature of Robespierre's wound, which destroyed much of his lower jaw and left him unable to speak coherently while causing continuous bleeding and excruciating pain that would torment him throughout the remaining hours of his life, without any significant medical attention to relieve his suffering. The 12 hours that Robespierre spent as a prisoner at the Committee of Public Safety headquarters, bleeding from his shattered jaw while crowds gathered outside to celebrate his downfall, represent one of history's most dramatic reversals of fortune, as the former dictator experienced the helpless terror he had imposed on thousands of victims. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe how word of Robespierre's capture spread rapidly throughout Paris, drawing enormous crowds who gathered to witness the spectacle of the man who had terrorized the city, now lying wounded and powerless, creating scenes of celebration that demonstrated the depth of fear and hatred his reign of terror had inspired. The legal proceedings against Robespierre were deliberately minimal, with the same revolutionary tribunal that had condemned thousands under his direction now applying summary justice to their former master, completing his death warrant in a matter of hours without any pretense of the due process that had been denied to his victims. The journey to the guillotine on July 28, 1794, was deliberately prolonged to allow the massive crowds that lined the route to witness the destruction of the man who had become the symbol of revolutionary excess, with thousands of Parisians gathering to mock and curse the architect of terror as he experienced his final moments of public humiliation. Contemporary descriptions of Robespierre's condition during his final journey paint a picture of complete physical and psychological destruction, with his blood-soaked clothing, bandaged face, and obvious agony creating a spectacle that satisfied the crowd's desire for revenge while demonstrating the complete reversal of his former power and authority. The actual execution of Robespierre occurred before one of the largest crowds of the entire revolutionary period, with contemporary accounts describing how the roar of approval when his head fell was among the loudest heard during the terror, marking not just the death of an individual, but the symbolic end of the systematic violence that had dominated French politics for over a year. The immediate aftermath of Robespierre's execution saw a dramatic reduction in the pace of revolutionary executions, with his death removing the driving force behind the systematic terror that had claimed thousands of lives and providing traumatized French society with a sense that the worst excesses of revolutionary violence had finally come to an end. Modern historical analysis has revealed how Robespierre's fall represented not just a political change, but a fundamental shift in the nature of revolutionary government, with his execution marking the beginning of a more moderate phase that would eventually lead to the end of the Radical Republic and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. As we examine the contemporary accounts, official documents, and eyewitness testimonies that chronicle Robespierre's dramatic fall from absolute power to bloody execution, we discover how the architect of revolutionary terror became the victim of his own creation, experiencing in his final hours the same helpless fear and brutal treatment he had imposed upon thousands of innocent victims, demonstrating the inevitable logic of revolutionary violence that consumes not only its intended targets, but ultimately its own creators, revealing how systems of systematic cruelty and political oppression tend to destroy everyone they touch, including those who believe themselves to be in control of forces that are ultimately beyond human control or rational management.